February 13th, 1542. A 19-year-old girl kneels at the execution block, screaming 5 words that echo through history. I die a queen, but innocent. Her crime? She wasn't a virgin when she married the king. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. Hit subscribe if you're ready to see the monsters hiding behind the crowns. Henry VIII's obsession with virgin queens wasn't about purity or religion. It was about control, conquest, and a narcissist's desperate need to feel powerful. And when 2 young women shattered that illusion, their heads rolled. This is the psychology of a killer king. Born in 1491, Henry Tudor wasn't supposed to be king. He was the spare, the backup plan, raised in the shadow of his older brother Arthur. While Arthur trained to rule England, young Henry lived a life of relative freedom, excelling at sports, music, and theology. He was brilliant, charming, and devastatingly handsome. A golden prince who turned heads at court. Then everything changed. Arthur died suddenly in 1502, and 11-year-old Henry became heir to the throne. But his father, Henry VII, never truly believed in him. The boy was kept isolated, controlled, barely allowed to speak without permission. For 7 years, he lived as a prince in a cage, desperate to prove his worth. When his father died in 1509, 18-year-old Henry exploded onto the throne. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall, athletic, fluent in multiple languages, and obsessed with being seen as the perfect Renaissance king. He jousted, hunted, composed music, and demanded constant admiration. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was his brother's widow, 6 years older, and initially, he seemed genuinely devoted to her. But beneath the charm, something darker was forming. Henry needed to be the center of attention in every room. He surrounded himself with yes-men who praised his every decision. When anyone challenged him, even gently, he interpreted it as betrayal. His mood could shift from jovial to terrifying in seconds. Courtiers learned to read his face, to laugh at his jokes, to never, ever contradict him. As the years passed and Catherine failed to give him a son, that golden prince began to rot from the inside. His jousting accident in 1536 likely caused brain damage, changing his personality forever. The athletic body thickened with age. Leg ulcers caused constant pain. But the psychological wounds ran deeper than any physical injury. Henry developed a pattern that would define his relationships with women. He would become obsessed with someone new, someone young and fresh, someone who represented everything his current wife no longer was. The chase thrilled him. The conquest validated him. But once he possessed them, once they became fully his, the fascination died. What replaced it was resentment, even hatred. He wanted perfection, but perfection doesn't exist in real people. His wives aged. They had opinions. They failed to produce sons. They became human, and Henry couldn't forgive them for it. Each disappointment fed his rage, and that rage needed a target. This is where his obsession with virginity took root. Not in religious morality or dynastic concerns, though he used those excuses. It came from something more primal. A virgin represented unconquered territory, a blank slate he could mark as his own. She hadn't belonged to anyone else. She had no past to haunt him, no comparisons to make him feel inadequate. In Henry's twisted psychology, a virgin queen was the ultimate proof of his power, his desirability, his worth. She was the fantasy that would finally fill the emptiness inside him. And when that fantasy cracked, when reality seeped through, the consequences would be written in blood. In Tudor England, virginity before marriage wasn't just expected for noblewomen. It was absolutely required. A lady's reputation could be destroyed by a single rumor. Families guarded their daughters like precious jewels, knowing that any whisper of impropriety could ruin marriage prospects and bring shame to an entire household. But these rules never applied to Henry. While young women faced social death for any sexual transgression, the king moved through court like a predator selecting prey. He had multiple mistresses, fathered illegitimate children, and faced zero consequences. Society turned a blind eye. After all, he was the king. Different standards applied. Here's where the psychology gets truly disturbing. Henry didn't just want sex. He could have that with anyone. What he craved was the specific experience of seduction, of being the one to corrupt innocence. He pursued women he perceived as virginal or inexperienced, enjoying the power dynamic of introducing them to physical intimacy. But he had a twisted code about it. He would approach these young women with what he considered a respectable offer, become his mistress. In his mind, he was being honorable by making them his official paramour rather than a one-time conquest. He genuinely believed he was doing them a favor, elevating their status by associating with him. The most revealing detail? Historical records show Henry was remarkably faithful to his mistresses. While carrying on these affairs, he treated these women with more consistency and respect than he ever showed his actual wives. He didn't rage at them. He didn't threaten them. Some received titles, lands, and marriages to suitable husbands when the affairs ended. So why the difference? Because mistresses had no power over him. They couldn't make demands. They couldn't inherit his throne. They existed purely for his pleasure and left when he tired of them. There was no deeper commitment to trigger his paranoia, no expectations to fail, no way for them to disappoint him. Wives were different. Wives had legal rights. They represented England. They were supposed to produce male heirs, manage households, and reflect perfectly on his reign. Wives could fail him publicly. Wives had opinions about his decisions. Wives aged alongside him, a constant reminder that he too was growing old. And that's what he couldn't tolerate. The virgin obsession intensified this dynamic. Henry convinced himself that if he married a pure, untouched woman, she would be entirely shaped by him. She would have no previous experiences to compare him to, no other man who had claimed her first. She would be grateful, devoted, and most importantly, completely under his control. He wanted women who existed only in relation to him, whose entire identity began the moment he noticed them. A virgin bride fulfilled this fantasy perfectly. She was a blank page, and he would write the story. But human beings aren't blank pages. They have thoughts, feelings, pasts, and futures that exist independently. And when Henry's virgin queens inevitably revealed their humanity, his narcissistic fantasy shattered. What came next wasn't just disappointment. It was rage at the ultimate betrayal. These women dared to be real. Modern psychologists who have studied Henry's behavior from historical records paint a chilling picture. Using diagnostic criteria for personality disorders, researchers scored him at 174 on measures associated with psychopathic traits. That's not a clinical diagnosis across centuries, but it reveals a pattern of behavior that would alarm any mental health professional today. The warning signs were everywhere, but in Tudor England, absolute monarchs answered to no one. Henry needed constant validation, not the normal human desire for appreciation, but an insatiable hunger for praise that could never be satisfied. Court records show he would fly into violent rages if anyone seemed insufficiently impressed by his accomplishments. He once had a servant beaten for failing to laugh enthusiastically enough at one of his jokes. One historian described his mentality perfectly. Henry always needed to be the prettiest girl at the party. Even in rooms full of nobles, diplomats, and scholars, all attention had to flow toward him. If someone else received praise, he would sabotage them. If another man appeared too handsome or athletic, Henry would find ways to humiliate them publicly. His paranoia grew with age. He saw conspiracies in innocent conversations. A wife whispering to a lady-in-waiting became evidence of treason. A courtier who seemed distracted during a feast was clearly plotting against him. The more power he accumulated, the more threats he imagined lurking in every shadow. But perhaps most revealing was how he used his wives as ornaments. They weren't partners or companions. They were trophies meant to reflect his greatness. When foreign ambassadors visited, Henry would show off his current queen like a prized possession, watching their reactions to gauge whether they were sufficiently impressed. This is why the virgin obsession mattered so much to his ego. An experienced woman might have standards, comparisons, expectations based on previous relationships. But a virgin? She would believe everything he told her. She would think his lovemaking was extraordinary because she had no reference point. She would be awed by his attention because she'd never experienced male desire before. In his mind, deflowering a virgin wasn't just about sex. It was about being worshipped as a god in that most intimate moment. It fed his narcissism in ways nothing else could. The red flags extended to how he rewrote reality to suit his narrative. When he wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon, he suddenly realized their marriage had been cursed by God because she was his brother's widow. Never mind that he'd been perfectly fine with it for 20 years. His current feelings became retroactive truth, and anyone who questioned this was guilty of treason. This ability to genuinely believe his own lies made him especially dangerous. He wasn't always consciously manipulating people. He had convinced himself that his desires were divine will, his rages were righteous anger, his cruelty was necessary justice. By the time he reached his 40s, Henry VIII had become a perfect storm of narcissism, unchecked power, and deteriorating mental state. But physical decline would soon accelerate the darkness already consuming him, and his virgin queens would pay the ultimate price for being caught in the path of his unraveling mind. January 1536. Henry crashes during a jousting tournament, his horse rolling over him with full armor. He's unconscious for 2 hours. When he wakes, something fundamental has changed. Courtiers whisper that the king who emerges from that accident isn't quite the same man who entered the tilt-yard. Medical historians studying the incident believe Henry likely suffered traumatic brain injury. The frontal lobe damage would explain what happens next. Increased impulsivity, reduced empathy, explosive anger that erupts without warning. But the joust wasn't his only health crisis. By his late 40s, Henry's athletic body has betrayed him. A leg wound from an earlier tournament refuses to heal, festering into ulcers that leak pus and cause agonizing pain. The stench is so overwhelming that courtiers can smell him approaching before they see him. He can no longer joust, hunt, or dance, the activities that once defined his identity as the perfect prince. His waist expands from 32 inches to 54. He develops symptoms consistent with type 2 diabetes, constant thirst, infected wounds, mood swings. Some researchers suggest he may have had McLeod syndrome, a rare genetic disorder that causes heart problems, muscle weakness, and progressive neurological decline, including personality changes and increased aggression. Watch how his capacity for love deteriorates in direct correlation with his health. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, knew the boy who became king. For years, he genuinely cared for her. He called her his true wife and wept when their sons died. Even when he wanted to divorce her, he never accused her of sexual impropriety. He simply wanted her gone, not dead. Anne Boleyn entered his life when he was still relatively healthy, still capable of sustained fascination with a woman. Their relationship lasted 7 years before marriage, and even after he ordered her execution, part of him seemed conflicted about it. He provided her with an expert swordsman from France, rather than a standard axe, a small mercy in a merciless act. But after Anne's death, after that jousting accident, after his body began its rapid decline, something darker emerged. Jane Seymour died in childbirth, sparing her from whatever might have come next. Anne of Cleves survived only because Henry found her physically unattractive and quickly annulled the marriage. She had the intelligence to agree to everything he wanted and disappeared into a comfortable retirement. Then came Catherine Howard. By this point, Henry was 50 years old, obese, in constant pain, and deeply paranoid. His treatment of this teenage girl revealed how completely his capacity for mercy had eroded. When her past was exposed, he showed none of the conflicted emotions he displayed with earlier wives. Just cold, efficient rage. The virgin obsession intensified precisely because everything else was slipping away. His body was failing. His youth was gone. His athletic prowess had vanished. But if he could still attract and claim a beautiful virgin, if young women still desired him, then he wasn't the decaying old man he saw in mirrors. His final wife, Catherine Parr, survived him only by carefully managing his moods and never challenging him. She understood what the others learned too late. By the end, Henry VIII wasn't capable of genuine love anymore. Only possession, control, and the fragile ego of a dying king desperate to prove he still mattered. Before the paranoia consumed him completely, before the pain and the rage made him incapable of genuine emotion, there was one woman who nearly broke Henry VIII, and she did it by refusing to give him what every other woman had surrendered willingly. Anne Boleyn arrived at the English court in the early 1520s, returning from years in the French royal household. She wasn't classically beautiful by Tudor standards. No blonde hair, no pale skin, no demure downcast eyes. Instead, she had dark hair, olive skin, and a sharp intelligence that showed in every conversation. The French court had taught her something the English ladies lacked: how to be fascinating. Henry noticed her around 1525. He was still married to Catherine of Aragon, still relatively young at 34, still capable of that boyish enthusiasm that made him chase what he wanted. He expected the usual pattern. He would express interest, she would be flattered and overwhelmed. They would become lovers, and eventually he would move on. Anne said no. Not just once. She kept saying no. When Henry offered her the position of official mistress, the role that other women would have killed for, she refused. When he showered her with gifts, she returned them. When he wrote her love letters, she responded with careful ambiguity that never quite promised anything. She had watched what happened to his previous mistresses, including her own sister Mary. They received temporary favor, then were married off to courtiers when Henry grew bored. Anne wanted more than that. She wanted to be queen, and she had the audacity to believe she could make it happen. For nearly 7 years, she played the most dangerous game in England. She kept Henry interested without ever fully surrendering. She would allow certain intimacies, then pull back. She would seem on the verge of giving in, and remind him that she valued her honor. She made him work for every smile, every private moment, every scrap of affection. And it worked. Henry became obsessed in a way he had never been with any woman before. She wasn't just another pretty girl at court. She was the one who wouldn't submit, the prize he couldn't claim, the conquest that kept eluding him. His desire turned into something darker, absolute determination to possess her completely. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine, Henry did the unthinkable. He broke England away from the Catholic Church, established himself as supreme head of the Church of England, and tore apart 1,000 years of religious tradition. All so he could divorce one wife and marry Anne. Think about that. He literally changed the religion of an entire nation because one woman wouldn't sleep with him without a wedding ring. In January 1533, Anne finally gave in. She was secretly married to Henry, and within months she was pregnant. She had achieved the impossible, a commoner elevated to queen, a woman who had bent the most powerful king in Europe to her will. But here's the terrifying truth. The moment she surrendered, the moment she became fully his, the game that had kept him fascinated was over. And Henry hated losing interest almost as much as he hated being told no in the first place. So the question that has haunted historians for centuries: was Anne Boleyn actually a virgin when she finally gave herself to Henry? The answer is frustratingly complicated. There were rumors. There are always rumors about women who wield power in ways that made men uncomfortable. Some whispered that Anne had been secretly contracted to marry Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland's son, years before she caught the king's attention. In Tudor England, A pre-contract was legally binding, as serious as marriage itself. If consummated, it would mean Anne wasn't a virgin. Percy denied it under oath. But he denied it while trembling before the king who could have him executed with a word, so his testimony is questionable at best. Anne herself never directly addressed the rumors, which was typical for noblewomen of her era. Denying such accusations only gave them more credibility. Here is what we know for certain. Anne and Henry's relationship spanned nearly 7 years before that secret wedding. During that time, they definitely engaged in some level of physical intimacy. His letters reference private moments. Court records mention them disappearing together. But how far did it go? Historians have combed through every scrap of evidence, trying to pinpoint when they first had full intercourse. The most likely scenario is sometime in late 1532 or very early 1533, just before or shortly after their secret wedding. The timeline of her pregnancy supports this. She gave birth to Elizabeth in September 1533, suggesting conception around December or January. What makes this psychologically fascinating is what happened at her trial 3 years later. When Henry's agents arrested Anne and fabricated charges against her, they accused her of adultery with 5 different men, including her own brother. They claimed she had mocked the king's sexual performance. They dredged up every possible humiliation they could invent. But they never questioned whether she had been a virgin when they married. Think about that omission. If there had been any real evidence that Anne had lied about her virginity, if the pre-contract rumors had substance, Henry's prosecutors would have used it. They were building a case for treason, and proving she had deceived him about something so fundamental would have been devastating evidence. They didn't use it because they couldn't, which suggests that Henry himself genuinely believed Anne had been a virgin, or at least virginal enough that he had been her first significant sexual experience. This matters because it reveals something crucial about Henry's psychology. Unlike Catherine Howard, whose hidden past would drive him into murderous rage, Anne's virginity wasn't the issue that destroyed her. He had been satisfied on that count. The conquest had been real in his mind. So what changed? Why did the woman he had moved heaven and earth to marry end up kneeling before an executioner's sword just 3 years later? The answer is darker than simple jealousy or political maneuvering. Anne's real crime wasn't sexual betrayal. It was something Henry found even more unforgivable. She refused to disappear into the background and become the submissive, grateful queen he expected. The chase had thrilled him. But the reality of who Anne actually was, that he could not tolerate. September 7th, 1533. Anne gives birth to a healthy baby. The astrologers had predicted a son. The royal nursery was prepared for a prince. Letters announcing the birth of a male heir had already been written, waiting only for the date to be filled in. Instead, she delivered a daughter, Elizabeth. Henry's face at that moment told Anne everything about her future. The disappointment wasn't just about lacking a male heir. It was about her failure to deliver what he had sacrificed everything to obtain. He had broken with Rome for her. He had made England a pariah among Catholic nations for her. He had humiliated his first wife and daughter for her. And she gave him a girl. But the gender of the child was only the surface problem. The deeper issue was Anne herself. She hadn't transformed into the grateful, pliable queen Henry had imagined. During their 7-year courtship, her independence and sharp wit had excited him. She challenged him intellectually. She had opinions about politics, religion, and court matters. She was bold, clever, and unafraid. When she was the unattainable prize, these qualities made her irresistible. Now that she was his wife, they made her intolerable. Anne continued to speak her mind in council meetings. She advocated for religious reform more aggressively than Henry wanted. She expressed jealousy when he showed interest in other women at court, which he found suffocating rather than flattering. She didn't fade into the background like a proper Tudor queen should. Worse, she had allies. People at court respected her intelligence and supported her religious views. She wasn't isolated and dependent on Henry's approval for her identity. She existed as a person beyond just being his wife, and that terrified him. Henry began to see her presence as a trap of his own making. Every time she voiced an opinion, he heard criticism. Every time she failed to conceive a son, he felt emasculated. Every time courtiers praised her, he felt diminished. The woman he had moved mountains to possess had become a constant reminder of his own poor judgment. 3 subsequent pregnancies ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. Each loss tightened the noose around Anne's neck. Henry started looking elsewhere, his eyes settling on Jane Seymour, a quiet lady in waiting who represented everything Anne wasn't. Demure, submissive, seemingly uncomplicated. By early 1536, Henry had convinced himself that his marriage to Anne was cursed. Not because he made a mistake, he couldn't accept that, but because she had somehow deceived him. In his warped logic, the woman who had resisted him for 7 years must have been manipulating him all along. The love he once felt transformed into something uglier, the rage of a narcissist who realizes his fantasy doesn't match reality and needs someone to blame. Anne's real crime was never about adultery or witchcraft or any of the absurd charges that would be leveled against her. Her crime was simpler and more human. She remained herself. The challenge that had once thrilled Henry, that sharp intelligence and independent spirit, was now the defiance he couldn't tolerate. She refused to become the fantasy he had created in his mind. And for that authenticity, for that refusal to disappear into his shadow, she would pay with her life. May 2nd, 1536. Anne is arrested at Greenwich Palace. The charges read like a fever dream. Adultery with 5 men, including a court musician. Incest with her own brother. Plotting to murder the king. Mocking his manhood in private conversations. Not one shred of real evidence supported any of it. Her so-called lovers were tortured until they said what their interrogators wanted to hear. Dates of alleged affairs were proven impossible. She had been elsewhere with witnesses. The timeline made no logical sense, but Henry didn't need logic. He needed her gone, and the machinery of Tudor justice would give him what he wanted. 19 days. That's all the time between her arrest and her death. 19 days to dismantle a queen, convict her of treason, and prepare the execution ground. During her imprisonment in the Tower of London, Anne fluctuated between defiance and breakdown. Sometimes she laughed hysterically at the absurdity of the charges. Other times she wept, unable to comprehend how the man who had torn apart Christendom to marry her now wanted her dead. She asked to see him, to speak to him directly. He refused. Henry had already moved on, courting Jane Seymour openly while Anne awaited her fate. The trial was theatrical, the outcome predetermined. When the verdict was read, guilty on all charges, Anne maintained her composure. She spoke clearly. "I am prepared to die, but I am innocent of these charges. I have always been faithful to the king." Even facing death, she protected her daughter Elizabeth's legitimacy by not admitting to crimes that would have branded the child a bastard. Henry, in what he probably considered mercy, ordered expert swordsmen brought from Calais, rather than using the standard executioner with an axe. A sword was quicker, cleaner, more dignified. It was the last small kindness he would show a woman he once claimed to love more than his own soul. May 19th, 1536. Tower Green. Anne wore a gray damask gown trimmed with fur. Her hair was pinned up, her neck exposed. She addressed the small crowd with remarkable grace, following the script expected of condemned traitors. She did not openly accuse the king, but asked people to pray for her. Then she knelt. The swordsman had hidden his blade in the straw, so she wouldn't see it coming. As she closed her eyes and began to pray, he called out, "Bring me the sword," to distract her. When she turned her head toward his voice, he struck from behind. One clean blow. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England for just 3 years, was gone. Here is what makes her story essential to understanding. Henry's virgin obsession. He never doubted that he had been her first true conquest. The charges against her were about infidelity after marriage, not deception before it. In his twisted mind, he had genuinely possessed her virginity, had won that ultimate prize. Her execution wasn't about discovering she had lied to him about her past. It was about punishing her for being a real woman instead of the perfect fantasy he had created. And that distinction would matter when his next Virgin Queen's hidden past came to light. Because Catherine, Howard's crime wouldn't be about who she became after marrying Henry. It would be about who she was before he ever noticed her. And that he would never forgive. Henry is 49 years old, obese, riddled with infected leg ulcers, and recently humiliated by his failed marriage to Anne of Cleves. His confidence is shattered. His health is deteriorating rapidly. He needs someone to make him feel young again, powerful again, desirable again. Enter Catherine Howard. She's approximately 17 years old. Catherine didn't scheme her way into the king's attention like Anne Boleyn had. She didn't play a calculated 7-year game of seduction. She was placed in his path deliberately by her ambitious family, the Howards, who had already lost one niece to the executioner as blade, but were willing to gamble another. Girl's life for political power. Her childhood had been anything but privileged. Despite being from a noble family, Catherine grew up in the neglected household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. The old woman ran a chaotic home where young women lived in crowded dormitories with minimal supervision. It was there, at around 13 years old, that Catherine's music teacher, Henry Mannix, began sexually abusing her. Mannix was an adult. Catherine was a child. In any rational analysis, she was a victim of predatory behavior. But Tudor society didn't see it that way. Female chastity was a woman's responsibility to guard, regardless of her age or the power dynamics involved. If something happened, it was her fault for not protecting her virtue. After Mannix, there was Francis Derham, a young man in the household who pursued her aggressively when she was barely 15. Their relationship was physical, though historians debate the extent. Derham later claimed they had been engaged, suggesting a pre-contract that would have made her marriage to Henry illegal. Catherine insisted he had forced himself on her. The truth likely lies somewhere in the complicated gray area of a teenage girl with no real agency being pressured by an older, more powerful man in her household. None of this was unusual for the time. Young noblewomen in these loosely supervised environments often experienced unwanted attention from men who knew. These girls had no real power to refuse them. What makes Catherine's story particularly tragic is what happened next. Her family recognized an opportunity. The king was lonely, vulnerable, desperate for youth and beauty to validate his declining masculinity. Catherine was pretty, vivacious, and young enough to be dazzled by royal attention. So they pushed her forward, dressed her perfectly, placed her where Henry would notice. And he did, immediately. To Henry, Catherine represented everything Anne of Cleves hadn't been. Young, English, beautiful by his standards, and seemingly innocent. She smiled at his jokes. She appeared impressed by his stories. She made him feel like the golden prince he had been 40 years earlier. That she was young enough to be his granddaughter didn't matter. That she had no choice in any of this didn't matter. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, and her ambitious relatives saw a path back to power through this teenage girl. They coached her on how to behave, what to say, how to make the king fall in love. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were feeding a child to a monster, hoping to profit from whatever scraps fell from the feast. Catherine Howard never had a chance. Her story was written before she ever met Henry VIII, and it would end the same way Anne Boleyn's had, with her head on the executioner's block. When Henry VIII first began courting Catherine Howard in early 1540, she understood instinctively what he needed from her. Not because she was cunning or manipulative, but because her family had coached her carefully. They told her exactly how to act, what to say, what never to mention. She played the role of an innocent maiden perfectly. Catherine blushed at his compliments. She seemed overwhelmed by his attention, as if she couldn't believe the king himself had noticed her. She was demure in public, playful in private, and presented herself as untouched by the corruptions of court life. Everything about her performance suggested she was a pure, virginal girl who had been waiting for a man like Henry to sweep her into romance. And Henry believed it completely, because he desperately needed to. At 49, with a body ravaged by disease and pain, Henry's ego required validation that his younger self had taken for granted. He needed proof that he was still attractive, still powerful, still capable of making a beautiful young woman fall in love with him. The idea that this fresh-faced 17-year-old genuinely desired him felt like reclaiming his lost youth. The virgin fantasy was essential to this delusion. If Catherine was experienced, if she had known other men, she might be comparing him unfavorably to younger, healthier lovers. But if he was her first, if she knew nothing else, then she would think his aging body was normal. She would believe his claims of virility. She would be grateful for his attention rather than repulsed by the reality of his physical condition. So when Catherine presented herself as innocent, Henry accepted it without question. He didn't investigate her past. He didn't ask uncomfortable questions. He saw what he wanted to see. But Catherine's family knew the truth. They knew about Mannix, the music teacher who had touched her inappropriately when she was barely a teenager. They knew about Derham, who had shared her bed in the Dowager Duchess's household. They knew these relationships could destroy the marriage before it began. Their advice was simple and ruthless. Never speak of it. What happened before doesn't matter now. The king wants a virgin bride, so be a virgin bride. Deny everything. If anyone from your past appears, claim you don't remember or that they're lying. Your future depends on this silence. Catherine followed their instructions. When she married Henry on July 28, 1540, she acted the part of a blushing bride experiencing her wedding night for the first time. Whether Henry truly believed she was a virgin or simply chose to ignore signs that suggested otherwise, we'll never know. What matters is that he wanted to believe, and she let him. For over a year, the lie held. Henry called her his rose without a thorn, and showered her with jewels, gowns, and affection. He seemed happier than he had been in years, revitalized by this young wife who made him feel like a man again rather than a dying king. But secrets from Catherine's past were already circling like vultures. People who had known her before, people who had witnessed her relationships with Mannix and Derham, watched her rise to queen with growing resentment and opportunity. In the ruthless world of Tudor politics, information was currency. And Catherine as past was about to become very valuable to someone willing to trade it for the king's as favor. The lie couldn't last forever. And when it finally shattered, Henry's rage wouldn't be about what Catherine did after becoming his wife. It would be about the fact that she had dared to let him believe he had conquered something that had already been claimed by lesser men. November 1541. The royal court is celebrating All Saints' Day when Archbishop Thomas Cranmer approaches the king with a letter. His hands tremble as he presents it. What's written inside will destroy Catherine Howard, but it might also destroy the messenger if Henry's rage turns on him instead. The letter came from John Lascelles, a Protestant reformer with no love for the Catholic Howard family. His sister, Mary Hall, had lived in the Dowager Duchess's household with Catherine years earlier. She had witnessed everything. Mannix's inappropriate touching, Derham sneaking into Catherine's bed, the chaos of unsupervised young women and opportunistic men. Lascelles didn't deliver this information out of moral concern. He delivered it because destroying the Howard family's power served his political interests. Catherine was collateral damage in a larger game. Henry's initial reaction was denial. Not his Catherine. Not his rose without a thorn. The accusers must be lying, seeking to hurt him by slandering his innocent young wife. He ordered an investigation, confident it would clear her name and punish those who dared spread such vicious rumors. The investigation did not clear her name. When interrogators questioned Mannix, he admitted to inappropriate familiarity with Catherine when she was around 13. He claimed he had only touched her in ways that stopped short of full intercourse, though his testimony suggested extensive sexual contact. In Tudor terms, she was deflowered, even if technically still a virgin. Then they questioned Francis Derham. Under pressure, he confirmed a sexual relationship during Catherine's time in the Duchess's household. He insisted they had been pre-contracted to marry, which would have made their physical relationship acceptable by Tudor standards, and her later marriage to Henry invalid. Catherine's own testimony shifted desperately as she tried to find a version of the truth that might save her. First, she denied everything. Then, confronted with witnesses, she admitted to the relationships, but claimed she had been forced. Then she said Derham had promised to marry her. Then she said Mannix had only touched her inappropriately, but they hadn't gone further. Each changing story made her look more guilty, not of the relationships themselves, but of deliberately deceiving the king. The court interrogators were uninterested in the nuances of a teenage girl being pressured by older men in an environment with no real protection. They were uninterested in her lack of agency, or the fact that her family had coached her to hide this past. They only cared about one question. Had she lied to the king about being a virgin? And the answer, by any reasonable interpretation, was yes. Henry's reaction wasn't immediate fury. It was something worse. Devastated silence. For days, he wouldn't speak about it. Then came rage so intense that his counselors feared for their own safety just being near him. He wept. He shouted. He blamed everyone around him for not protecting him from this humiliation. But most of all, he blamed Catherine, not for being a victim of predatory men, not for being young and powerless in a dangerous household. He blamed her for making him believe he had conquered something pure, for letting him feel young and desirable again, for allowing him the fantasy that this beautiful girl genuinely wanted his aging, diseased body. She had made a fool of him, and for that there would be no mercy. The charges brought against Catherine Howard included adultery with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber. According to the prosecution, she had continued seeing him after her marriage to Henry. Love letters were presented as evidence. Witnesses claimed they had been alone together. But here's what modern historians have uncovered. The adultery charges were almost certainly false. The evidence was weak, contradictory, and extracted under torture or threat of torture. Culpeper and Catherine had exchanged letters, but the content suggested romantic interest, not consummated affair. They may have met privately, but chaperoned meetings were common at court. Nothing definitively proved they had been physically intimate after her marriage. If Henry had executed her only for adultery, her story would mirror Anne Boleyn's, a queen destroyed by fabricated charges of infidelity. But Catherine's situation was fundamentally different. Her real crime, the one that Henry could not forgive, was what happened before she ever met him. The relationships with Mannix and Derham. The fact that she had concealed this past. The reality that when Henry believed he was claiming a virgin bride, she had already been touched by other men. This wasn't about her betraying him during their marriage. It was about her making him look foolish. Every moment he had felt young and virile with her had been based on a lie. Every time he had proudly shown her off to foreign ambassadors as his beautiful young queen, she had been hiding a past that would humiliate him if revealed. In Henry's narcissistic psychology, this deception was worse than adultery. It struck at the core of his identity, his need to be seen as powerful and desirable. She had let him believe a fantasy, and when that fantasy shattered, his ego couldn't survive it intact. Catherine was taken to the Tower of London in early February 1542. She was 19 years old, possibly even younger. In her final days, she reportedly asked for the execution block to be brought to her cell so she could practice laying her head upon it properly. She wanted to die with dignity, even if she hadn't been allowed to live with agency. February 13th, 1542. Catherine walked to the scaffold on Tower Green, the same spot where Anne Boleyn had died nearly 6 years earlier. She was so weak from fear and stress that she could barely stand without assistance. Her final words were brief. She acknowledged she deserved death, not because she had actually committed the crimes charged, but because that's what condemned traitors were expected to say. She asked for prayers for the king and mercy for her family. The axe fell. Catherine Howard, child bride and scapegoat, was gone. 2 women, both young, both caught in the trap of Henry VIII's virgin obsession. Anne died because she refused to disappear into quiet submission after marriage. Catherine died because she had a past before marriage. Different crimes in Henry's eyes, but the same outcome. Death at the hands of a king who could not tolerate reality interfering with his fantasies. The pattern was complete, and it would reshape English law itself, ensuring that Henry's wounded pride would echo through history long after both queens were buried in unmarked graves beneath the Tower Chapel floor. Catherine Howard's execution should have been the end of the story. A tragic death, another queen lost to Henry's paranoia and cruelty. But Henry VIII wasn't satisfied with simply killing her. He needed to ensure that his humiliation could never happen again. So he did what tyrants do when reality wounds their ego. He changed the law itself. In 1542, shortly after Catherine's death, Parliament passed a new statute that had never existed before in English history. The law declared that if any woman who was not a virgin married the king without revealing her sexual past, she would be guilty of high treason. The punishment was death. But it went further. Anyone who knew about the woman's past and failed to inform the king would also be guilty of treason. Her family, her friends, anyone who stayed silent could be executed alongside her. Think about what this law actually represents. It's not about protecting the royal bloodline or ensuring legitimate heirs. Those concerns had existed for centuries without requiring such a specific statute. This law existed for one reason only. Henry's wounded pride demanded it. He had been made to look foolish. He, the king who had reshaped England's religion to suit his desires, had been deceived by a teenage girl. His fragile ego, already damaged by age and illness, couldn't tolerate the idea that someone had gotten away with making him believe a lie. So he weaponized the legal system to punish not just Catherine, who was already dead, but any future woman who might dare to do the same. The law essentially made a woman's entire sexual history before marriage the king's property. She had no right to privacy, no right to leave her past behind, no chance to start fresh. Everything she had ever done, every relationship she had ever had, belonged to the crown's scrutiny. And if she failed to report it, death. This wasn't justice. It was revenge codified into law. It was a king so psychologically damaged by his obsession with virgin queens that he literally restructured English legal code to protect his ego from future damage. Consider the implications. Any woman Henry might have shown interest in after this law passed would have faced an impossible choice. If she had any sexual experience, even if she had been abused or coerced, as Catherine had been, she would need to confess it to the king before marriage. But confessing meant risking his rejection, and possibly his rage. Staying silent meant risking execution if anyone from her past ever came forward. The law trapped women in a psychological prison created by one man's narcissistic need for virgin brides. Fortunately for England's remaining noble women, Henry only married once more. Catherine Parr, his 6th and final wife, was a widow, so her sexual experience was acknowledged and acceptable within the context of her previous marriages. She couldn't be accused of deception because everyone knew she wasn't a virgin. But that law remained on the books, a permanent monument to Henry VIII's obsession. It stood as proof that his need to conquer virgins wasn't just personal preference or royal tradition. It was a psychological compulsion so powerful that when it was threatened, he used the full force of royal authority to protect it. 2 women had died. Now the law itself bore the scars of his damaged ego. Step back from the individual tragedies and look at the complete picture of Henry VIII's reign. What emerges isn't a story of unfortunate political necessities or unavoidable historical circumstances. It's a pattern of obsession, control, and violence directed specifically at young women who failed to fulfill an impossible fantasy. 6 wives total, 2 of them executed. Both were young. Both had been seen by Henry as prizes to be conquered. Both died not for actual crimes, but for failing to match the idealized versions he had created in his mind. But the body count extends far beyond his wives. Lady Jane Rochford, Anne Boleyn's sister-in-law, executed for allegedly helping Catherine Howard meet with Culpeper. Margaret Pole, elderly Countess of Salisbury, brutally killed because of her family connection to Catherine of Aragon. Countless others imprisoned, tortured, or exiled because they were somehow connected to the women who displeased the king. The virgin obsession threaded through all of it like poison. When Henry pursued a woman, he needed to believe she represented untouched purity, a fresh start, validation of his desirability. The chase fed his ego. The conquest proved his power. But the aftermath, when these real human women with thoughts and histories and agency revealed themselves, triggered his rage. Anne Boleyn refused to become invisible after marriage. Execution. Catherine Howard had a past before marriage. Execution. The specific details differed, but the fundamental pattern remained identical. Henry's fantasy collided with reality, and women paid with their lives. What makes this particularly chilling is that he genuinely believed he was the victim in each situation. In his mind, these women had betrayed him, deceived him, failed him. He never saw himself as the predator pursuing young women who had no real power to refuse him. He saw himself as the wronged party, justified in his vengeance. This delusion extended to how he rewrote history. After Anne's execution, he declared their marriage had never been valid, making their daughter Elizabeth illegitimate. After Catherine Howard's death, he erased her from official records as thoroughly as possible. He couldn't tolerate permanent reminders of his failures of judgment. The virgin queens weren't the only victims, but they were the most visible. Their deaths sent a message to every woman in England. The king's desire was both the highest honor and the greatest danger. Being noticed by Henry VIII could elevate you to unimaginable power. It could also guarantee your destruction. And throughout it all, Henry maintained the facade of the righteous king. He attended church services. He wrote theological texts. He presented himself as a defender of morality while executing teenagers for having sexual histories. The hypocrisy was staggering, but no one dared point it out while he lived. By the end of his reign in 1547, Henry VIII had executed an estimated 72,000 people for various offenses. Some were political enemies. Some were religious dissenters. But among them were women whose only real crime was being human in the presence of a king who demanded perfection, youth, and virginity that could never be reclaimed once lost. 2 young queens, both beheaded on Tower Green. 2 monuments to one man's toxic obsession with conquering what he could never truly possess. Complete control over another human being. When modern psychologists examine Henry VIII's documented behavior across his 38-year reign, they reconducting what is called a psychological autopsy, diagnosing mental health conditions in historical figures based on written records, contemporary accounts, and behavioral patterns. The diagnosis that emerges is disturbing but consistent. Malignant narcissism with possible sociopathic traits. Malignant narcissism combines 4 elements: narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial behavior, paranoia, and sadism. Henry displayed all 4. His grandiose self-image required constant reinforcement. His willingness to harm others without remorse escalated over time. His paranoia about conspiracies and betrayal intensified with age. And his capacity for deliberate cruelty, particularly toward the end of his life, suggests he derived satisfaction from exercising power through pain. But here's what makes his case psychologically fascinating. He wasn't always this way. The young Henry who took the throne at 18 showed genuine capacity for affection, loyalty, and even empathy. Early in his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, he wept openly when their sons died. He showed real grief, real connection to another person's suffering. That capacity eroded steadily over the decades. By his 40s, Henry's ability to maintain genuine emotional bonds had significantly diminished. By his 50s, it had essentially disappeared. The question is why. Was it purely psychological deterioration, or did physical factors accelerate the decline? Medical research suggests both played roles. His traumatic brain injury from jousting likely damaged areas responsible for impulse control and emotional regulation. His chronic pain from leg ulcers would have created constant stress, flooding his system with cortisol and other hormones that affect mood and decision-making. Possible diabetes would have caused blood sugar fluctuations that intensified irritability and cognitive problems. Some researchers point to McLeod syndrome, a genetic condition that causes progressive neurological damage. It would explain both his physical symptoms and his personality changes. The muscle weakness, the heart problems, and critically, the increased aggression and decreased empathy that characterized the neurological decline associated with the disease. Whatever the medical causes, the psychological result was clear. Henry became progressively less capable of seeing other people as fully human. They became objects that either served his needs or threatened his ego. There was no middle ground. His virgin obsession fits perfectly into this framework. A virgin represented the ultimate object to possess. She had no independent sexual identity, no past to complicate his ownership, no experience to challenge his self-image. In his deteriorating psychological state, this type of absolute control became increasingly necessary. As his capacity for real intimacy died, his need for symbolic conquest intensified. He couldn't connect authentically anymore, so he sought women who could be shaped entirely by his will. Virgins were blank slates. They were safe. They couldn't compare him to healthier, younger men because they had no comparison. When Anne and Catherine revealed themselves to be complete human beings with their own thoughts, histories, and agency, Henry's damaged psychology couldn't process it as normal human complexity. He processed it as betrayal, deception, and unforgivable offense against his authority. The virgin obsession wasn't separate from his psychological deterioration. It was a symptom of it, growing more extreme as his mental state declined. And because he wielded absolute power, his personal pathology became England's nightmare, written in the blood of young women who never stood a chance against the monster he had become. Strip away the crowns, the political intrigue, the religious upheaval, and the historical complexities. What remains at the core of Henry VIII's virgin obsession is something far more disturbing than dynastic ambition or theological conviction. It was never about producing legitimate heirs. He already had a son with Jane Seymour. It was never about religious purity. He broke from the Catholic Church and defied the Pope to get what he wanted. It was never about ensuring royal bloodlines. He had illegitimate children, he acknowledged, but didn't execute their mothers. The obsession with virgin queens was about one thing only: an aging man's desperate psychological need to feel powerful when everything else was slipping away. Henry's body was betraying him. His athletic youth had vanished into obesity and infected wounds. His mental faculties were deteriorating. His contemporaries no longer feared him out of respect, but out of terror. He had become a monster, and on some level he knew it. But if he could still attract a young, beautiful, untouched woman, if he could still make her desire him, if he could still be the first man to claim her, then maybe he wasn't the decaying tyrant staring back from the mirror. Maybe he was still the golden prince who had once been the envy of Europe. Virginity became the ultimate proof of his worth. Not hers, his. A virgin bride validated his desirability in a way an experienced woman never could. She had nothing to compare him to, no younger lovers to remember, no standard by which to judge him lacking. This is why Anne's independence enraged him, and Catherine's hidden past destroyed him. They weren't playing the role he needed them to play. They weren't the blank slates he could write his fantasy upon. They were real people, and real people have histories, opinions, and the audacity to exist beyond his control. Two young women lost their lives, not because they committed actual crimes, but because they shattered an illusion that Henry's fractured psychology required to function. They reminded him that he was mortal, flawed, aging, and ultimately powerless against the passage of time. The true horror isn't just that Henry killed these women. Kings throughout history have executed people for terrible reasons. The horror is that he did it to protect a lie he was telling himself. He couldn't face his own decline, his own failures, his own humanity. So he eliminated anyone who forced him to see the truth. Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard died for the same reason in the end. They were real. And Henry VIII had long ago stopped being able to tolerate reality. Their graves lie beneath the Tower Chapel floor, unmarked and nearly forgotten. But their story resonates because the psychology behind it still exists. The need to control, the inability to accept aging or imperfection, the violence that emerges when fragile egos are threatened. Henry VIII's obsession with virgin queens wasn't about the women at all. It never was. It was about a broken man with absolute power, trying desperately to conquer the one thing no king ever can, his own mortality. And when that conquest failed, heads rolled.